This is NatSec Matters.
I'm host Andrew Shapiro with Beacon Global Strategies. Today, I'm joined by Iris Ferguson, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Arctic and Global Resilience in the Biden administration. In her capacity as Deputy Assistant Secretary, she authored the Arctic strategies for the Department of Defense and the Air Force. Ms. Ferguson previously served at the Department of Commerce and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Ms. Ferguson joins us today for discussion about Arctic security, where we assess the United States' current role in the Arctic and the region's rising strategic importance. Stay with us as we speak with Iris Ferguson. Iris, thank you for joining NatSec Matters.
Yeah, pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invite.
So today we're going to talk a little bit about Arctic policy and your experience in it, and then talk about some of the current policy issues regarding Arctic policy, particularly in the United States and among other Arctic powers. So to start off, can you share how you got involved in Arctic issues and what initially drew you to this area?
Thanks for that question. I first encountered Arctic issues when I was actually working on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee quite a while ago when we were trying to pass the Law of the Sea Treaty back in 2007-8 timeframe. Was one of the last efforts of Congress to try to push that treaty through. And as we were getting ready for hearings, I remember the Russians were planting a flag near the North Pole to try to exert sovereignty. And so as I started to research that area more, it became very clear that it was really an area that we, the U.S., needed to be taking seriously, that we had sovereignty issues at play, but also that, the Arctic has so many. It's like a prism in a sense, and that it has so many different angles that you can look at, whether it be environmental or geopolitics, some of the hard security issues like homeland defense, but also international angles and working with allies and partners. And it's just such a really fascinating region to invest time in. And if you've ever read any Arctic Explorer books, many of the explorers kind of have a part of their books where they talk about why they've fallen in love with the region, that it's kind of captivates their fascinations, that there's a beauty of the landscape and the people that kind of sinks into you. And I think that spell has also been cast on me as well.
Well, it certainly has, was an area that has risen in importance over the last decade. I remember during the Obama administration over a decade ago, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton said that the Arctic was an area of increasing strategic importance. From your perspective, how has U.S. policy toward the Arctic evolved since then, especially in terms of defense strategy, but also more broadly?
You're absolutely right that the region has changed pretty dramatically in the last 10 to 20 years. In particular, a lot of that is, fundamentally due to climate change. The region is transforming and warming at some 4 times the rest of the world, and that's allowing for increased physical access, increased economic opportunity, changing of sea routes, of course, but also for increased security access. And so, as the United States perspective and the security interests of the United States, we think we were able to sort of treat the Arctic as a little bit of exceptional, a bit of a strategic buffer over time. We were really heavily focused, especially, some 10 years ago, on the Middle East, and we were able to, kind of think that the Arctic is taken care of because of this buffer. But with the changing physical environment, also coupled with some of the changing technologies of our competitors and our adversaries and their ability to actually reach the homeland and reach our interests, we've had to kind of recalibrate how we're thinking about our interests in the region. There are real sincere homeland security interests for the Arctic. For the U.S. perspective, we have a lot of our strategic missile warning and missile defense, which is becoming increasingly complicated due to some of this technology innovation from partners, whether it be hypersonics or cruise missiles. We have, pretty robust air bases in particular up in Alaska. We've got a lot of space situational awareness assets, including in Pacific and Greenland, where you just saw, Vice President Vance going to visit. So there's been a fundamental shift to think in the U.S. thinking about how do we protect those interests? How do we ensure that we're securing our own territory while also trying to keep the region stable and secure? The sense that Arctic exceptionalism is over, I think, is pretty is pervasive throughout many of our Arctic partners as well, and thinking that, we can no longer just think about this as an environmental problem only. It needs to be a security problem as well.
You mentioned that climate change is leading to greater accessibility to the Arctic. What do we think is the timeline for ships being able to traverse the Arctic? How is the U.S. planning for that? Is it thinking about what we need in order to confront that future?
Yeah, I think it's really important that folks understand that there are various different routes across the Arctic. And it's like diving a little bit into the details here, but there are three primary shipping routes that are often talked about. The first is the Northern Sea route around Russia, which is the most heavily trafficked. It's open, kind of relatively ice-free between June and September timeframe. Then there's the Northwest Passage across Canada, which has much more ice to it. It also has some 36,000 islands to navigate. So it's a little bit more of a complex route. And then there's a transpolar route, which is really the game-changing route, which goes across the North Pole. The scientific estimates are anywhere between the next, 20 years to even as early as 2040, that could be ice-free. That's why you see increasing levels of interest from shipping companies, but also from our competitors, in particular China and Russia, and really trying to invest heavily in some of their ice-capable hardened ships. Does the U.S. need to be investing in more icebreakers and in more capacity for navigating and protecting interests in that region? Absolutely. But I will say that our environment in and around the Arctic is very different depending on where you sit. And so, like I said, Russia has been able to navigate the Northern Sea route for quite some time, not only because they have icebreakers, but also because it's a little bit warmer, especially on the western side because of the Gulf Stream.
And there's some speculation that as these areas that were formerly under permafrost unfreeze, there may be some attempts at, securing areas for resource extraction. Is that something that's in the far future, in the near future? And are we, the United States, taking that into account in our own planning?
Yeah, I think it's now in many ways. I think that the opportunity in the resource space is kind of unfolding in front of our eyes. Certainly, Russia has significant investment in extracting of resources. Some 20% of their GDP comes from the Arctic, and the vast majority of that is from resource extraction, including around the Yamal Peninsula, but also increasingly on the eastern side of Russia, as well as around mining interests. There are a lot of interests that we potentially have as the United States and in and around Alaska, and also in concert with some of our allies and partners in looking at our resourcing. But one of the challenges that we have is that it's not necessarily been explored or mapped as effectively as it would need to. And it's also really expensive to do some of this extraction and do so in a way that's environmentally sound. And so there's a lot of, I think, upfront investment that we need to be making in terms of mapping and thinking about the infrastructure required you would need to actually pull these resources out of the ground and make use of them. I think everyone agrees that there's a lot of potential there, but it's how you go about doing it and how you can effectively map opportunity. That's the first order of business. You,
as a Deputy Assistant Secretary at DOD, you were focused on Arctic issues. What were some of the things that you were working on? Was it mostly focused on, Alaska and the role that it plays? How does the Pentagon, think about the Arctic, back when you were there and going forward?
Yeah, well, I think it's evolving. I talked a little bit about how, the region is kind of gaining in strategic importance in some of the calculus that's going into play in terms of security interests. But before my office existed, I had the privilege of being the first Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Arctic and Global Resilience. And there really wasn't an integrator within the department, like looking at all of the various interests that the department has. And that includes with the combatant commands and the services and with our allies and partners. So in the combatant commands, commands is actually, it's quite tricky because of the overlapping interests of the combatant commands that all kind of meet at the top of the world. You have NORTHCOM, which thinks about homeland defense issues. You have EUCOM, which is traditionally thinking about the European theater, of course. And then you have INDOPACOM, which owns and operates many of the assets that we rely upon in the Arctic, but are often kind of thinking further south. And so trying to create a collective interest amongst the combatant commands was a heavy emphasis that we had. We also put out a new DoD Arctic strategy, which really talked about the changing strategic environment that was taking place for the department and tried to outline some of the potential investment priorities. And then we also worked really closely with our allies and partners because it's incredibly challenging to operate in that region alone. And really, we all have a lot of vested interest together. When I started that job, we didn't have a forum for talking about security interests at all. And in fact, the Arctic Council, which is exists primarily for safety and for scientific activity, doesn't allow for the conversation around security interests. And so we created a new forum called the Arctic Security Policy Roundtable, where I could talk to my counterparts in the various Arctic allied nations about security interests for the first time. Happy to say that forum is still continuing, but just to show kind of the broad swath of efforts that we undertook that were really kind of the first ever of its kind. And I think we laid the foundation pretty well for the ongoing years.
In terms of investment that needs to be made to prepare for, the coming changes in the Arctic, what did the Biden administration do in terms of icebreakers or other types of capabilities? And what do you think we need to do to be ready for the challenges that we're going to face going forward?
Yeah, well, I think that one of the challenges of the Arctic region, and I think this transcends administrations, is its relative prioritization in the resourcing matrix. I think it's really easy to talk about resourcing, but very hard sometimes to execute, especially when you're faced with a lot of competing priorities and real-time conflicts that emerge inevitably across any administration. But one of the things that we laid out in our Department of Defense strategy, and also in the White House also put out a national strategy for the Arctic region, where security was the first parameter and the first topic, which is again a signal to the importance that the administration was thinking about the issue. We really focused in the DoD strategy on domain awareness in particular, which I know that that's a little bit of a wonky term, but it's basically, can you see threats? Can you identify threats that are coming? Do you have the right command and control for assets and communications architectures? Do you have the right weather forecasting to be able to do not only current operations, but future operations? And so we made some pretty select investments in some of our, seeing infrastructure, and in addition to our communications infrastructure. I think we created the glide path for us to do more, and I'm actually encouraged by a lot of the conversation today around the homeland defense architecture and thinking about different sensor technologies to include not only ground-based layer and over the horizon radar, but also space-based layers too, that can see and detect some of the more advanced missiles. It needs to be kind of an all-encompassing approach. In terms of the physical, actual platform assets, there was a lot of work to make sure that we had the right power projection capacity within Alaska, including the final bed down of the F-35s in Alaska. And there was initial conversations around how we can kickstart our icebreaker fleet. I think it's very well known that the U.S. has been languishing in terms of building icebreakers for quite some time. And that's probably symptomatic of a larger issue around shipbuilding. But one of the things the Biden administration did was create something called the Ice Pact, which was a unique collaborative effort between the U.S., Canada, and Finland to start to share best practices and technologies and labor around building icebreakers so that we can actually start building them and putting them in the water in the sooner than later timeframe.
You've mentioned Alaska a few times, and Alaska obviously makes the United States an Arctic power. And it's also home to, as you mentioned, our power projection, and we have missiles there. What do you see as the role of Alaska going forward? Will there be deeper investment in Alaska? Is the Pentagon thinking long-term about how Alaska plays into our Arctic strategy?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Alaska is, is one of the cornerstones of our national security. And I think it's undersung. Certainly, the Alaska delegation talks about it frequently, but I think it's undersung in D.C. There is so much at play in Alaska. There was a famous quote from an airman called Billy Mitchell that said, Alaska is, the center of the world for national security for all intents and purposes. And I think that's apt. Where it sits strategically, if you just look at a map, you can see how important it is from the top down. The flight times to Europe, the flight times even to the Indo-Pacific are closer than you see than from the West Coast. And I don't think that most Americans think about it that way because we're used to seeing a map that goes from east to west instead of thinking of it as a globe in a sense. And so I do think that there's real opportunity for further investment in Alaska, for investment not only in the military infrastructure, but also potentially in infrastructure that's dual use. There's long been discussion of trying to create a deep water port at Nome that there's in the process of building because there is no deep water port along the kind of central northern part of Alaska, which you're seeing increased activity along that Bering Strait. We should be thinking about infrastructure that has dual use purposes for both civilian use, but also potentially military should the need arise. You also heard in recent posture testimony about the opportunity to open old Cold War era bases that were previously closed in and along the Aleutian Islands, just for the ability for us to have increased opportunity for naval access. We have one base that's open right now along the Aleutian Islands called Shimmy at the very, very, very end. And it's a really critical location for us, but it's also a vulnerability because of how it's used as a divert location too, just even when you're flying across, just having a place to land in the event of emergencies. Having more options like that would be very useful to us militarily. And I think Alaska provides a lot of really important opportunity.
Let's move on to some of the other Arctic powers and how they're approaching the Arctic, starting most obviously with Russia. Our neighbor in Alaska has a significant amount of its landmass is in the Arctic. From your vantage point, what are the key strategic objectives behind Russia's actions in the Arctic?
Yeah, so the Arctic makes up a significant amount of their GDP. I think 20 to almost a quarter of it. And I think that they largely think about the Arctic region as in terms of both a treasure chest and also a fortress. They've been recently refurbishing Cold War era bases. They've been making significant investments in and along the Northern Sea Route to really invest in that Northern Sea Route and try to capitalize on the opportunity that exists. Militarily, I think there was an assumption that the war in Ukraine would have put a dent in some of their Arctic activity. And I think it's slowed some of it, but despite the heavy attrition that we've seen, they still have many of their strategic assets in place, certainly in and around the Kola Peninsula. They're also very interested in protecting their second strike capabilities, of course, that are there. They're really wanting to make sure that the economic development that they invest in is also secure. So, a lot of the military infrastructure you see them investing in is about anti-access and area denial. And they also want to make sure that if there's a conflict with NATO, that they're able to still operate. So they're always kind of looking for opportunity, I think, to bolster their positioning in the region, and they really want to be seen as the preeminent Arctic power. One other thing that they've been, I think, investing in, I think often people think about Russia's interests in the Western sphere, but we've seen increasing amounts of investments in the eastern side of the Arctic, including in their most eastern province, Chukotka, which is, I think, new-ish. Just several years ago, they built the world's first floating nuclear plant, which is a feat, of course, in engineering. But, it was stationed outside of a town of 4,000, but yet has the capacity to serve 100,000. That's quite significant signaling in terms of what their ambitions for developing the region, and especially developing the region that's closer to Alaska.
In terms of the U.S. response, what do you think are the most effective strategies to counter Russia's expanding influence in the Arctic without escalating tensions with them?
Yeah, I think, trying to not escalate is, I think, really important. It's obviously a tricky balance, but deterrence matters. And I think being present matters. Some of the ways that we have done that over time, they often do bomber runs often around the coast of Alaska, or often probing the air defense zone off of Alaska. We meet them. And NORAD fighters meet those bombers to ensure that they know we're there, that we can see them, that we don't allow and we aren't accepting of incursions into our sovereignty. I think continuing to be able to do that is really critical, showing that kind of where our lines are for security, and increasingly, showing up to show what that means, and that includes, where we see lines and challenges of them cooperating with the Chinese, and that's what we've seen over the last summer, where we saw increasing alignment militarily between the Russians and the Chinese off the coast of Alaska, like unprecedented, and unlike anywhere else in the world, where we have seen naval operations, also bomber campaigns together, also Coast Guard operations together. That's significant signaling, and that's what causes certainly the Pentagon to pay attention, but also making sure that we're able to be responsive to those activities and know that they're coming will be increasingly important for the foreseeable future.
We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with more of our discussion with Iris Ferguson.
Beacon Global Strategies is the premier national security advisory firm. Beacon works side by side with leading companies to help them understand national security policy, geopolitical risk, global technology policy, and federal procurement trends. Beacon's insight gives business leaders the decision advantage. Founded in 2013, Beacon develops and supports the execution of bespoke strategies to mitigate business risk, drive growth, and navigate a complex geopolitical environment. With a bipartisan team and decades of experience, Beacon provides a global perspective to help clients tackle their toughest challenges.
Let's move on to China and how it approaches the Arctic. It's positioning itself as a, quote, near Arctic state, and it's actively pursuing its interests in the region. How do you view China's strategic objectives in the Arctic?
Yeah, China has long been interested in being a part of the governance of the Arctic region. They've been an observer to the Arctic Council for quite some time. They see the clear economic potential that exists within the region and the reduction of shipping time should the transpolar route in particular open back up. They also see the geographic opportunities that exist, and if they were able to get a position and a holding in some of the Arctic nations, that would help their broad projection capabilities. They've tried to acquire several old bases that we had in Greenland, and in addition to making forays into other Arctic nations, including as recently as Norway near Kirkenes, trying to access some of the deep water ports there, often going into what are arguably less economically sound communities and trying to make overtures so that they can gain a positioning there. They also are really interested in scientific diplomacy, which also could have dual use implications. So some of the work, the research that we were seeing them do in and around oceanographic and bathymetric data could certainly be used for submarines. Of course, their interest in ground stations for satellites could also be used for military purposes. So, I think for the Pentagon, really kind of having an eyes wide open thinking about what their motivations are and where they're really seeing potential opportunity for themselves, and us being able to work with allies and partners and having them have a more transparent look at what their real intentions are, but also us, again, being able to show up where we have our own red lines. And I would say our own red lines are certainly where they're operating militarily in and around our coastline.
Some argue that China's presence in the Arctic is part of a broader strategy to exert influence over global trade. How does this dynamic impact U.S. national security interests in the region?
Yeah, I would agree with that I think that they see opportunity in the geography and how, like I said, that it would decrease shipping time significantly from going around Africa or going through the Suez Canal should those routes open up. If that comes to pass and there's increasing levels of commercial activity in and around the Arctic ocean, then, it becomes an equally important role for our Navy to be playing in protecting sea lines of navigation, just like we do in the Indo-Pacific and throughout the rest of the world. So our ability to be able to show up and protect the rules-based order, protect sea lines of navigation is going to be increasingly important as that ocean opens up. I think we have a little bit of time to prepare, but we need to be making some of these investments and strategic decisions now instead of when it's too late.
Let's move on to Canada, our neighbor to the north, which has long held territorial claims in the Arctic. Does Canada face challenges asserting their sovereignty in the region? And how does that impact U.S.-Canada relations?
Yeah, Canada has been a really close partner in our, one of the United States' closest allies for a long time. The role that they play in NORAD, in particular, in our homeland defense architecture, and the way that we work together hand in glove in thinking about air defense in particular and threats that could come over the pole and into the U.S. homeland cannot be understated. So I want to really champion the role that NORAD has played in protecting not only Canadian interests, but also U.S. interests, and that I think that it will continue to play. One of the challenges that Canada has is that, only less than 1% of their population lives in the Arctic, yet it houses the largest coastline in the Arctic of any Arctic state. They have the Northwest Passage, which has immense opportunity, but it's very challenging to navigate with the 36,000 islands and it being relatively ice-locked. They've, I think, have a lot of potential to develop parts of their Arctic region that have both benefits for the local community, but also for defense interests. But doing so, hand in glove will be critical to their success. There's a unique political moment I feel like Canada has to be able to make those investments now. I think, anyone that's watched Canadian politics and knows about their role in NATO recognizes that they've been underinvesting in some of their security interests, not only for themselves, but also for the interests of NATO. There's a unique moment in time where there is broad domestic political, I think, approval for investment in the Arctic region, which could also bolster their own security interests and also bolster collectively the U.S. interests if they were able to follow through with them. The recent announcement that Canada made with the Australians in the purchasing their over-the-horizon radar is a really interesting example of how they're trying to become first movers themselves in investing in their own security, and that would have broader downstream effects, I think, for the U.S. and also for NATO.
You've talked about the cooperation between the U.S. and Canada. NORAD is a joint venture between the two countries. Is there anything that the U.S. can learn from Canada's approach to Arctic security and cooperation?
Yeah, well, I think that Canada has kind of put themselves in a position of forced collaboration in some ways, where they've worked really hand in glove with many partners to get the assets that they need, whether it be acquiring new submarines or thinking about different styles of platforms or looking at the new missile defense architecture, for example. I think sometimes dependency can be a helpful signal towards further cooperation. And I think looking at how they've approached broad partnership in that it's a necessity in some ways could be helpful for the United States because in the Arctic in particular, you really cannot go it alone. Even if we wanted to do everything ourselves, one, it just is so cost prohibitive and challenging. It's also a really tricky environment to navigate. You really want to be depending upon individual silos of excellence and then building a broader collaborative picture in order to have the greatest security at large for not only for us, but also for our allies and partners. And that, of course, creates a deterrent effect to our adversaries when we're all working with one another. So I think to the extent that we're taking notes from Canada, it could be in how they think about cooperation at large and the unique attributes that can come from broad collaboration.
You made a really important point, which is the Arctic is so vast and the resources required are so large that it's impossible for the U.S. to do it alone. We need to work with partners and allies in order to pursue our Arctic interests. Can you run through, which partners and allies you think it's important for us to work with? Finland and Norway come to mind, but are there others who you think it's important for the U.S. to be coordinating with in order to get the maximum impact from its Arctic policy?
Absolutely. First and foremost, it's the Arctic allies, right? So that's Canada, Norway, Finland, Sweden, Denmark, and then Iceland, and working collaboratively with them in advancing our interests. That's, again, back to why we built this Arctic Security Policy Roundtable, was to bring these countries together so we could have a common understanding of the threat picture, which is different in our various regions, but also has, it's important for us to have eyes wide open understanding of what each of us are seeing in our own backyard and how maybe we can make investments together. Maybe we can find cold weather equipment that we could all go in on together. Or is there unique opportunity for us to all save money by investing in the same missile defense apparatus or communications architecture? I think there's a lot of opportunity that exists within this alignment of the Arctic allies, which are not only geopolitically aligned, as we understand and know, but they also have money. And they also have very strong militaries for the most part. And so where we're able to leverage one another's capabilities, that's a no-brainer from my perspective. And it follows, I think, as well, what the recent Secretary of Defense Hegseth has said around empowering allies. Where we can empower allies that helps us as well should be something that we should explore. So in addition to the Arctic allies, the UK, I think, is a really important player. They have unique special forces arrangements with the U.S. and Norway, and have long been very active in high North security conversations. France plays a really interesting role in addition to Germany, and the Netherlands also has been an interesting player, and one that's been wanting to invest more in Arctic security efforts as well. And of course, we haven't really talked about NATO, but NATO itself is another really critical player in how Arctic security and Arctic policy is being shaped. Prior to Finland and Sweden joining NATO, I think that the Arctic kind of sort of registered at NATO, but I don't think it really fully registered as an opportunity. Now that the aperture has opened for NATO, I do think there's real possibility for capability development in and amongst our NATO partners. So the opportunity within NATO is really profound as they look to create new regional plans and think about the broad investment possible. As nations are investing in the Arctic, can that also go towards their contributions? I think we'll see how that plays out over the next couple of years, but it's a pretty strong game-changing scenario to have Finland and Sweden joining and having the alliance as a whole be looking at security interests in the Arctic that also, of course, protects the alliance.
Yeah, it's an important point that you make, which is, Finland and Sweden are recent additions to NATO. They have their Arctic powers themselves, and it offers an opportunity for coordination and planning that didn't exist before they were members, and hopefully NATO will take advantage of that. Are you seeing any evidence that that's started, or is it something that you think is an opportunity that they should look to seize?
Yeah, I am seeing evidence that it's starting, and I think that you can see it by the rhetoric coming out of the international staff at NATO. You can also see it in venues like the Munich Security Conference, where you have NATO officials talking about the Arctic in a way that's more profound and specific than in the past. And I think it's based off of, it's like any bureaucracy, right? Everybody wants to do the strategy, then the plans. Nobody wants to get ahead of the planning. But as plans are inevitably including different parts of territory, then inevitably you're going to have to resource and build capabilities to protect that territory. So I think it's a natural progression, of course. But I do see there to be an uptick of interest in and around NATO, and actually diving into some of these really important details that can actually get to the capabilities needed. One other thing I should say in terms of the allies and partners and the opportunity with other allies and partners is that we really have been focusing a little bit on the European side of the Arctic. But if you look at the Indo-Pacific side of the Arctic, which that's really where U.S. interests are heavy within and around Alaska, I think there's an opportunity for us to think more creatively around our Indo-Pacific alliances and protecting our interests in and around the Arctic. One of the things that in the Pentagon, we have had some wake-up calls around the activity between Russia and China militarily off the coast of Alaska, and having to pull assets all the way up from Hawaii to respond. It's doable, but it's a challenge. Can we be looking at some of our partners like South Korea or Japan to also exert some influence in and around the region that also benefits us as a whole, and starting to think a little bit more about the unique side of the Indo-Pacific side of the Arctic, not just the European side of the Arctic?
Well, we would be negligent if we had an Arctic discussion, didn't discuss Greenland. And while we don't want to delve into the political points regarding Greenland, can you explain why Greenland has become a critical focal point for U.S. national security, particularly in terms of its geographical position and resources?
Yeah, Greenland is obviously super fascinating in general. And anybody that asks about Greenland, I always really encourage folks to go visit. It's really close. It's closer for folks on the East Coast to get to Greenland than it is to get to California. So jump on a plane. It's nonstop flights out of Newark right now, or over the course of the summer, into Nuuk, Greenland, and you can actually go see the island for yourself. Greenland, by geography, if you look at a map, it's actually part of the North American continent. And so just inherently, right, geographically, it's really important for the United States. We have a important space base called Pitifik in the northwest corner of Greenland. It performs really important missile defense for us in the same way that a site in Clear, Alaska, kind of if Clear is the 10 o'clock, then Pitifik would be the 2 o'clock, performing a missile defense warning in addition to space situational awareness for the United States. So that positioning of that base is really critical. We also have a really unique relationship with the Greenlanders, which I think is really important to underscore. We showed up in Greenland sort of unannounced in the 1950s to build several bases without a lot of forewarning or agreement. And, we've been since then kind of building on the trust deficit that exists for us. And I think we are in a pretty good spot where we left in the Biden administration and really, I would say allowing us to have our security interests protected and an open door for us to have more military and security interests in the island should we want it and need it. And so I think it's really important that as we think about Greenland, we not only think about the importance that it has, but also that, that we are on an island based off of a defense treaty that exists between us and Denmark, but also, sort of at the will of the Greenlandic population as well. And just understanding that, our security interests are also their security interests and vice versa. So having a bit of a symbiotic relationship. And I think the Greenlandic people in particular, they're really interested in economic investment. They're interested in security, of course, themselves, and making sure that their own livelihoods are protected and that they have, they have promise for the future as well. But they also don't necessarily want to be dictated to. And so just having that, I think that in mind will be really critical for U.S. security as well.
Well, as we wrap up, for those who want to follow Arctic issues, in particular the U.S. government, obviously the Pentagon is a key player. What are the other stakeholders in the U.S. government that you think are worth monitoring as in regards to Arctic policy?
Oh, Andrew, this is a great question. I actually may, very shortly, write an op-ed about one of the challenges to Arctic policy is personnel, and that it is kind of it's always someone's, 1/10 of one person's job, and so if that, and so trying to create positions that are very clear, that have this job to integrate across their various departments or across the whole of government, I think is really critical to U.S. success. Some of the positions that exist now are largely in the State Department. of course, the U.S. ambassador position for the Arctic region that was created in the Biden administration. Seeing who gets nominated for that position will be critical. The senior Arctic official office that exists that kind of handles the Arctic Council affairs, that person in that office is really critical. How Coast Guard, starts or continues to think about the opportunity with icebreakers and their role in the Arctic region and who is kind of the central player for that will be really critical, in addition to DHS in general, and thinking about borders and how, do we have the right, security for the borders in and around Alaska to protect our own interests. Will also be important to watch. Department of Transportation, of course, too, as you think about shipping lanes and routes. And then the NSC is the other big player here, where, one of the things that I think has been challenging for the Arctic is not necessarily having a central person at the NSC. A lot of the Arctic conversations have resided in OSTP, which is the Office of Science and Technology Policy, and it's really important, right? But it's different, has a different flavor when you start to think about national security, and having someone in the National Security Council whose job is to think about Arctic security would send a really strong signal to the whole of government approach that the U.S. is actually taking security interests seriously. So that's my plug to this current administration to hopefully get that position across the line.
All right, last question, which is a little bit of a curveball. We talked about the Arctic, but was there any focus in your job in the Antarctic? And are there security issues that are raised there? Mostly it's for research. We have, a research facility down there, which we fly people in and out using U.S. military assets. But is there any thought being given at the Pentagon and elsewhere in the U.S. government about security issues related to the Antarctic?
Oh, well, absolutely. At the Antarctica, we by proxy sort of did Antarctica issues in my office. And I think that there's opportunity for the renaming of our office at some point because it suffers from the same challenges, right, of having many different overlapping themes. And you need a kind of an integrated approach to thinking about an area that has overlapping requirements being thrown at it, in addition to how we think about presence and what security interests really are. In Antarctica, it's governed by treaty, and there is no military presence allowed, save for transport of scientific efforts, and for, of course, life and safety. And so, as we think about what our security interests are as the United States, ensuring that we still have the ability to have scientific diplomacy there, that we are still investing in our infrastructure at McMurdo and elsewhere in Antarctica, that we can continue to show up. We have the only ski-equipped aircraft, the LC-130s, that can fly into Antarctica, in addition to Greenland. And so continue to invest in those kind of capabilities has applicability for both poles in the same ways that icebreaking capacity has applicability for both the Arctic and for Antarctica, in the same way that polar assets have to be invested in with specific intention because many of the geospatial satellites that go around don't hit the poles. So we need to be thinking about, if we need communications architectures in the north, we also need them in the south, and having to think about those unique investments. So we did think about it quite a bit, Andrew, and if we'd had more time, we may have gotten around to renaming the office, but didn't quite make it. Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you, Iris, for this fascinating discussion about Arctic security. We very much appreciate it. And it's an area that's very much worth watching going forward. Thank you again.
Yeah, thank you.
That was Iris Ferguson. I'm Andrew Shapiro. Please join us next week for another episode of NatSec Matters.
NatSec Matters is produced by Steve Dorsey with assistance from Ashley Berry. NatSec Matters is a production of Beacon Global Strategies.